Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. In our annual tradition, the Comic Culture crew took our cameras to HeroesCon 2019 on the third weekend of June. As always, the organizers put together an amazing collection of writers and artists from comic books, newspaper strips, and webcomics. HeroesCon is my favorite show because it remains focused on connecting fans with the people who create the comics. Colleen Doran is a master of comic art with a diverse career that includes her creator-owned series, A Distant Soil, stints at DC and Marvel Comics, and her collaboration with Neil Gaiman on The Sandman, Troll Bridge, and their latest, Snow, Glass, Apples. I asked Colleen about her process.
When I ink myself, I don't do full pencils. My stuff tends to be pretty light, and then I ink directly. They call it think and ink, where you just go directly to ink. But for something like this tonal work, I don't ink it at all. It's printed from the pencils.
And when you were working on traditional superhero comics, how is it working in that genre versus working on something where it's a lot more, fantasy or a lot more reality-based?
Well, I mean, either you can draw or you can't. As far as I'm concerned, if a genre challenges you, maybe you have draftsmanship problems you need to work out. If you're a draftsman, you should be able to draw anything that comes your way. So there are certain things I like drawing more because I get to exercise my imagination in ways that I think play to my strengths for design and decoration. In superhero comics, you're going for energy and power, and that comes naturally to artists like Jack Kirby. Energy and power was sort of everything he had going for him. But other stuff is more lyrical in nature, and I think I'm better at that, or better at character. But other than that, if you can't draw, you can't draw. So, you know.
And just one final question, just about storytelling. The flow of the page, when you get a script or where you're working on your own stuff, how do you sort of think about that page so that it gets the reader to kind of work their way through it, but also at the same time each panel is its own unique entity?
Well, each panel has to be a snapshot in time with the border between it, the jump point where the reader makes the cognitive leap of all the actions that took place between the one panel and the second panel. So when I'm thinking, I often think in terms of moving pictures and then try to snapshot in my head the shot that would work best, and then move that shot around until I get to the point where I think that would make the best individual shot, and then I use that. But sometimes I do a lot of thumbnails, and sometimes it just comes very, very quickly. And I also think in terms of the overall page design, I want that to be pleasing as well. There are some writers that prefer regimented segments of time, such as 6 panels per page or 9 panels per page. And other writers let me experiment quite a bit with using non-panel progressions and mixing things up a bit and doing more with page design, which can suggest the movement of time from one point to the next without panel borders. So it depends. On some jobs, I'm giving a lot of leeway, a lot of creative freedom to figure that out for myself. And on other jobs, the writer wants a lot of control over the pacing. And if I'm working with a writer, and fortunately I'm lucky enough to work with a lot of really great writers, I try not to make too many changes from their intention. They know what they want. They're all experienced. They're all excellent. And I respect them, and I try to give them the best version of what is in their head. I try to be the hands that they can't be.
I spoke with artist Bob Hall about the series that made him feel like he was in control of his art, the West Coast Avengers.
One of the things you find when you first start doing it is that you're not as much in control of what you want to do as you thought you were. Because, for one thing, deadlines, everything has to go faster than you thought it would. And you have to draw all of these things that you never really thought about drawing. Chairs, tables, telephones, It's a little easier now with the internet because you can just look something up, but you used to go crazy back in the 70s trying to look for reference on the most common items. So and you learn how to, quote, fake that by almost memorizing shapes of things. But I didn't really click for me, I think, until the West Coast Avengers.
And what was it about that series? You had some iconic characters in that, but it's one that the audience really related to. It's one that obviously went on to its own ongoing series. So when you're looking at those characters at that time, what's kind of going through your head?
Well, that Roger Stern, who created the series as a writer, had picked just the right people to be in California. They just seemed to belong on the beach or in a backyard barbecuing stuff. And they were much more laid back than the New York Avengers. And that was fun. It was a different take. I had done the regular Avengers series, but this was just a new take on the characters, a very different feel and mood to it. And it was nice to be there to begin that.
And finally, you've worked with a lot of different inkers, and I'm wondering, when you get an inker that everything meshes and everything works well, how does that collaboration work for you? Does that allow you to relax with your pencils, or does that just make you feel like you can do something and they're always going to make it a little bit better?
There are some inkers that it wouldn't matter what you did, they would make it better. There are others that it takes a while to mesh, but once you find that you can begin to pencil toward the inker's strengths. And I don't think you can relax a little bit unless you say, okay, make a deal, I'm going to do them looser. There are some inkers that like that. There's others that it drives crazy, and you just have to work it out with the inker that you're working with.
Mark Trail is a newspaper comic strip that debuted in 1946. I asked James Allen, the current creator, how the strip has endured for 73 years and how he got involved.
Boy, it's easy to tell you how it's endured for so long, because it was kind of when everybody's talking about going green and conservation and environmentalism, this strip was out there decades ago in the foreground talking about it and celebrating it. And that's as the country's kind of come around to that, that's what's kept it relevant. I mean, when you talk of some classic strips, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but I mean, I love Flash Gordon, but at some point it just kind of ran it had its run, and Mark Trail's been fortunate, knock on wood, it's been able to stay relevant because of conservation issues. I grew up in Gainesville, Georgia. Wasn't originally from there, but two of the original creators, Ed Dodd and Jack Elrod, were from Gainesville, and there's no shortage of constant reminders of Mark Trail and Ed Dodd and Jack Elrod in Gainesville. I've seen busts of Ed around town, his head, like a little statue of his head up on a pillar, you know. There's street names, Cherry Lane, Mark Trail Lane, Ed Dodd Trail. So, and there's even a history center. When Ed officially retired, he gave a lot of his personal effects, and they've got it set up like a representation of how his studio actually used to look. And I'm not kidding. This is going to sound hokey or contrived, but I used to ride my bike across town to find that museum. It was up on our square. We've got a historic square. And I'd go in there, I'm not kidding, just to touch the drawing table of a guy that made it in this kind of work. I had no clue back then I would actually be the guy doing it someday. I reached out to Ed. He had retired, and I went to visit him. It's kind of late in his life, and I don't want to go into too many details, but as a kid it was kind of bittersweet, because you just figure this was the guy that made it, but oh, here he is kind of late in his late years. Sometime after that, I got up the courage to just call Jack Elrod, and this was back in the day when you could dial 411 for information, and I just figured he lived in Atlanta. I didn't know. I wound up calling 3 or 4 different Jack Elrods before I actually got the right one. I was probably 17 or 18 at this point, and he said, if you're ever down here, he lived in Sandy Springs right out of Atlanta. said, if you're ever down here, come on by. And it took me, I don't know, about 30 years to get up the nerve to do that. And I met him in 2004. He invited me to come to his house. Some friends, mutual friends, put me in touch with him. And I just figured he's probably getting on up in years and he might need an assistant if he doesn't already have one. I had self-published some comics in the 90s that nobody read. So I took that stuff to show him that I could draw, and he basically wasn't impressed. But he gave me a stack of Mark Trail work, and he said I might need an assistant in a couple of years. That turned into 10 years, by the way. Things fell into place as he got older, and I don't know, I got hungrier for it. I started bringing him a lot of work that he couldn't. Kind of, why refuse this? Just pay the guy a little bit and use it, you know. So it happened like that. A lot of the work readers saw both in the Sunday and the dailies through 2013 was my work, but his name was still on it. He had the contract. But he right there towards the end of 2013 just decided, I'm done. And he said, I'd like to retire the day after my 90th birthday, which was March 30th, 2014, and I officially started. King Feature sent me a contract. It was predated, because they don't want there shouldn't be a gap, something might happen. Lawyer stuff, I guess. But my contract officially started March 31st of 2014. My name appeared on the dailies about 6 weeks after that, and my name first appeared on the Sundays, May 24th, which is my birthday, and I got to do it on my favorite animal, which is the white rhinoceros, and it's just been comic bliss for me ever since.
Ron Randall's career in comics spans nearly 40 years. While he's worked for Marvel and DC, CrossGen and Dark Horse, Ron's best known for his creator-owned series Trekker. I asked Ron about the history of Trekker.
It's something I created at Dark Horse many years ago. She had her own series for a while, but it got to the point where I was only able to do the story in little fits and starts, a little story here, a little story there, which wasn't serving a series very well. So I put the whole thing on hiatus for a while, but now I'm back to telling the stories in an ongoing, continuous, sustained way, which is a real thrill.
So what is it about the character that makes you want to tell her stories?
That's a really good question. When I created the series, I was asking myself what would be my dream project. There's a long story about how that all came about, but that was the point of that exercise. And so what I'm getting to do now is just continue to fulfill that dream project, and that's a pretty compelling opportunity to have. It's a story of a young woman who's a bounty hunter, a science fiction series, and so I felt that basic premise was pretty compelling. A world steeped in violence and having a character in that situation, which is actually a really horrible place, and she doesn't realize that there's more to her and more to the world than that, and that's sort of what the series is about, that long form journey that she's on of self-discovery and finding out the potentials within herself and in the world itself, and having a larger stage to step onto. So from the very beginning, I'd planned something that started like with a very narrow scope or scale and would gradually expand, and then reach a final resolution point. So if you're a storyteller, you want to get that story told, and even if it takes a while and there have been delays in getting there, that thirst to get this story told in a satisfying, completely well-rounded way has never left me. In fact, it's only sort of grown more compelling over the years as these characters and this world have lived inside of my head and my heart. The longer they live there, the more incessant I feel the need to get this story out and told.
And as a storyteller, how have you seen your the stories that you're telling with these characters improve or evolve as you, as a storyteller, improve and evolve?
Well, yeah, absolutely. From when I first started this 30 years ago, I've just gotten a lot better at my craft, both my craft as a writer and as an artist. When I began the series, I'd been working professionally as an artist for a few years already, so I had some of those chops where I was getting a handle on that stuff. But I was a brand new writer, and I knew I wasn't ready to tell this large-scale story that I had in mind, so I started with short, self-contained action-adventure stories, because I thought I think I can land that ship. I think I can bring that one home pretty well and make it a good, entertaining ride for a reader. But I would plant seeds in those early stories, introducing a character here or a concept of an organization that we refer to. And I said, when I get a better handle on my craft as a writer, I'll be able to develop that and bring it to full bloom later on. So that's kind of where we're at in the story now. I have a greater sense of control over what I do, and I think I'm more able to efficiently get the result that I want. I don't have to sort of poke around as much. I've gone down as an artist and as a writer enough sort of false starts to sort of see them coming now. So I'm better able to say, I want to go from here to here, and I'm much clearer on how to get there in a way that just sort of keeps the story moving forward at the sort of compelling pace that I think an action adventure series should have. Not a lot of meandering, not a lot of wandering around, not a lot of treading water. I want each story to feel like a real, positive, palpable next step in the journey.
And I guess my final question will be, you're doing this on your own through crowdfunding. So I'm wondering, how do you keep your readers engaged and make sure that they're aware of the next project that's coming out?
Well, I'm on social media as much as I can stand to be. Given that my primary job is supposed to be writing and telling the stories, but as you say, when you're doing the book on your own, another absolutely vital part of that job is getting the word out as much as possible. So I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Facebook, and I have a newsletter, and I reach out through Kickstarter updates to the people that have backed the campaign in the past. So I do basically, the short answer is everything I can to try to stay engaged with the readers who already know about Trekker, and then also at the same time try to find new readers, and going to conventions too. I forgot to mention that, and that's absolutely crucial. I think going to conventions is the most effective and least efficient way to find new readers, because I can have one-on-one conversations and answer questions and have back and forth, and that's a great way to engage with readers. But I can only do that in one-on-one conversations, and it would take a lot of road warrior action to be able to get a whole following just through the conventions. So I have to use other avenues as much as possible as well.
Jun Brigman is the co-creator of Marvel's Power Pack and the artist of the newspaper strip Mary Worth. I asked her about working on comic books and comic strips and what the differences are.
Both require good, clear drawing and storytelling. The main difference is the format. With a newspaper comic strip, the format is very limiting. It's very set. You can only do a certain number of panels. They have to be a certain shape. You can never do vertical panels. You're just very limited by the format. Also, it's very repetitive. It's just the nature of the beast that the story advances on the Sunday page. And then during the dailies, you kind of expand and repeat what happens in the Sundays. With comic books, you do have a lot more freedom. You have a whole page, and you can divide that page into as many panels as you need to tell the story. The panels can be whatever shape or size you want. So you do have a little more free artistic freedom, I think. The other difference is a newspaper comic strip, if it's successful, you don't really have any closure. It kind of goes on and on and on. But with a comic book, if it's a monthly book, every month you finish 22 pages and kind of finish that part of the story, and you have a little more sense of closure with a comic book.
And you're currently working on Mary Worth, and when you took over the book, it seems you took the visuals and reinvented them. So I was wondering, was that something that you just were able to do on your own, or did you have to get approval from the syndicate?
Strips like Mary Worth are a little different from other strips like, say, Dagwood and Blondie or Barney Google, where they have a very set look and you really have to follow the style of the previous artist. I also worked on Brenda Starr, and Brenda Starr and Mary Worth are very similar in that as long as the readers know it's Mary Worth and know it's Brenda Starr, you have some leeway to interpret. And the previous artist, Joe Giella, he's an amazing artist, and he had his own look and his own style. But that was different than the artist before him. and I couldn't begin to imitate Joe, so I had to sort of interpret his interpretation of the character. But as long as the readers still know it's Mary Worth and it's recognizable, I can do that.
And my final question is, how good are Mary's muffins?
They're the best. They make everyone feel better. So, but I think what we need to do is we need to finally publish the recipe for her muffins. I think they're going to be morning glory muffins, which are really good. They have like pineapple and pecans and raisins in them, and everybody likes them. So.
Telling a story effectively in a visual medium like comics means combining clarity with dynamic layouts, power and energy with subtlety, and knowing what to include and what to exclude. Jack Kirby and John Buscema knew how to do it, as does Keith Giffen, one of the great storytellers in comics. I asked him what makes good storytelling.
Tell the story. Tell the story. Make it as plain and as obvious as can be. You can do your little flourishes if you want, but primarily the story's got to be told. And what I try to do is I try to tell the story in as straightforward a way as possible. I might break off every so often, do a little personal thing, make a joke, put an action scene in there, but the story's more important than any of the people doing it.
And is there any idea that you have when you're putting together a page, like some folks like to weigh heavy on the bottom with some big action scene, or?
I rule out 6 panels and I tell the story. Though actually there's one thing I try to do. I don't like pulling away from a scene in the middle of the page. I'll usually try to arrange it so that if there's an action sequence, then you go back to the headquarters and they talk for a while. I like the action sequence to end on the last panel. Then you turn the page, you go to the headquarters, it ends. I like to, condense each scene so that it's if you yank out those pages, you can still basically read the story because you're not missing half a page. I'm not a huge fan of that cutting away in the middle of everything.
And as a writer, when you're sort of developing a character and getting their personalities down, is that something that you plan out ahead of time, or is it something that as you're...
Organic. It's completely organic. I start off with the basic idea of what the character is supposed to be, and I just see where it leads me. I see where it leads me. I've never had a character end a book the way he began, and I've never had a character that when I end the book, I'm not surprised at where he took me.
Right, and my final question will just be, you've worked on a lot of great books, from Justice League to Legion of Superheroes to Ambush Bug. So I'm wondering, which of the books that you've worked on do you look back most fondly?
10. A one-shot from, I think, Boom, that I think is one of the, it's an issue where the artist, the plot, everything worked. It was just one of those rare issues where everything worked out fine, and that's probably the one issue that I'm most proud of.
HeroesCon is a place where artists can come and meet fans. That's what George Vega did. I asked him about his work in trading cards.
I do a lot of sketch cards for Upper Deck on almost all of their Marvel properties for the past 5 years. And on top of that, I've also done sketch cards for Aliens, Firefly, and those are mostly all Upper Deck properties. I've also done work for Cryptozoic, which they actually have the properties for Rick and Morty. That's probably the biggest thing I've done this year so far. I've done a bunch of Rick and Morty cards, about 70 sketch cards. To explain the sketch card industry, what it is you get a 1 in 7 chance of pulling an actual sketch card. And I'll pull one, for example. It's something like this, and it's hand-drawn directly on the card. It's not mass-produced. So it's a great thing for fans. And it's a great thing for fans because they get to own original art pulled randomly out of cards. So it's like they're like chase cards and collectibles. Different artists go for different rates online, on eBay and such. But this is basically what I'm known for at the moment. And
so when you're doing these art cards, this is a little different because obviously this piece is the size of the card, but when you're doing like a mass-produced card or mass-printed card, would that be something you're working at the same size, or are you working on a larger sheet and shooting down?
Oh, that's a good question. You actually work double, so whatever the scale is, you could actually work even triple, and then they'll scale it down. As a matter of fact, I did that for one of these cards. If I can show you, this was mass-produced, and this is a Horror Meets Girl. And this is for Brains Publishing, and this is an actual foil stamp card, and this was mass produced. And this one in particular, I worked double scale, so can't do the math right now for some reason. I'm usually good at math. Anyway, so it's about 6 by 2.5, 5. So 5 by 6 is the size. Yeah, 2.5 by 3.5. No, 2.5 by 3.5. So that would be 5 by 7. There you go. So and so it's foil stamp. And as you can see, so this would be an example of that type of card where I work larger and then it gets shrink down.
And when you're working on your art, are you using watercolors, acrylic? You're using pen and ink. What sort of tools do you use to create your art?
Okay, most of my finishes, if they're full color, they're Copic marker, which I have my full set here that I take with me on to conventions, and I start with pencil, then I ink, and then once the ink is dry, I'll come in with Copic markers. Which, I mean, you can use any marker. Most artists use any marker, but Copic seems to be the most popular one. It works great. It's a great product. The colors blend really well. You have a brush end and a broad end, and I think that gives the artist the ability to almost give you a watercolor feel on the piece.
Thanks to everyone at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find, the organizers of HeroesCon, for allowing Comic Culture to bring our cameras to the convention. Thanks to Cole Yarborough and Anastasia Sitnikova for being our crew this year. HeroesCon 2020 is the third weekend of June, so mark your calendars. Thanks for watching Comic Culture. We'll see you again soon. Comic Culture is a production of the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.